The roaring sound of revelry was a beast. It clawed at the opulent walls of the grand hall, a boisterous, overwhelming presence that made Arya's skin feel as though it would split. She burrowed deeper into the hushed embrace of a stone alcove. Her singular aspiration, her fervent plea, was to simply vanish, to cease to exist. Every clinking of glasses felt like a final farewell, a grave marker being placed upon her own life, for this was meant to be her moment, her destiny. Instead, her gaze was a traitor, perpetually drawn back to the elevated dais. To Kale, his smile was a honed blade, sharp and dazzling, and it was not directed at her. It was for Lyra, her sister. Lyra shone like a celestial body bathed in moonlight, her gown of shimmering silver cascading as she rested a hand upon Kale's arm. They were a picture of perfection, a flawless deception that had exacted a terrible toll. Consequently, a frigid, heavy mass settled in Arya's chest, stealing her breath. All the heartfelt promises Kale had murmured to her since their childhood days. They had all dissolved into nothingness, gone the instant Lyra set her sights on him. Just breathe, Arya. Do not dare to weep where they can see. Yet the tears persisted, hot and furious. The biting chill of the stone behind her was the sole sensation that felt genuine, a stark contrast to the searing shame igniting her cheeks. She could sense the collective regard of the assembled guests, their sympathy a tangible touch she desperately wished to shed. She was the broken offering at this celebration, the maiden overlooked. With each pulse of her heart, the shame intensified. She risked another glance, a self-destructive habit she couldn't break. Her eyes drifted past the ecstatic couple, upwards, towards the highest seat, occupied by the sovereign ruler, Lucian Thorn. He sat apart, a monarch sculpted from glacial frost and simmering rage. His attention was not on the festivities. He was observing his captives, and then, in the fleeting moment of a single breath, it happened. His eyes, as cold and empty as a void, as terrifying as a tempest, locked onto hers. There was no trace of gentleness, no hint of compassion. It was akin to being caught in the eye of a hurricane. In that instant, sheer dread stole her breath, and a profound certainty settled within her. This night was poised to descend into an even greater abyss. This entire observance was a wearisome, futile endeavor. Lucian occupied his throne of carved obsidian, watching the lesser kin revel in their crude allegiances. His sole objective was to endure it, to maintain the facade of absolute authority that prevented his dominion from fracturing, and then to seek refuge in the blissful tranquility of his own thoughts. For 10 years, that quietude had been his sole solace. The primal entity within him, the roaring, instinctual beast that was his birthright, had fallen dormant following a profound calamity, and he was grateful for its silence, for emotion was a malady, a vulnerability that could cost him everything. He had learned that grim truth through torment and devastation. His advisors droned on about commerce and pacts at his feet. He perceived the assembled individuals not as sentient beings, but as mere pawns upon a vast chessboard. Kale, the heir apparent, had executed a shrewd maneuver, aligning himself through marriage with the ambitious member of the Vale lineage. Lucian filed this information away, experiencing no internal reaction whatsoever. His gaze swept the assembly, the ennui of a king conducting an inventory, until it arrested. In a shadowed recess, a solitary female wolf was nearly submerged in her own desolation. It emanated from her in palpable waves, a bitter aroma permeating the air, an unwelcome disturbance. Another untidy, unrestrained sentiment polluting his meticulously ordered existence. He was on the verge of averting his gaze, of dismissing her entirely. But then, something deep within his core, a dormant entity entombed for a decade, began to awaken. It was not a thought, it was a sensation. A deep, perilous tremor that vibrated through his very being. It was so alien, so unwelcome, that his hand tightened its grip on the throne's armrest, the stone digging into his palm. What was this? He looked again at the maiden, at the single tear tracing a path down her cheek. The tremor intensified, a possessive, primal growl coiling in his gut. A fissure had just appeared in the icy facade of his soul, and it bore a name he had yet to ascertain. A shadow fell upon her, and the sickly sweet fragrance of Lyra's perfume assailed the air. There you are. Lyra's voice was like syrup, yet Arya knew it was laced with venom. We were so concerned for you. She stood radiating triumph, with Kale hovering behind her like a spectral penitent. He dared not meet Arya's gaze. Of course he wouldn't. But Lyra's eyes greedily absorbed every detail of Arya's disheveled attire and tear-streaked countenance. "It's a delightful evening, wouldn't you agree?" Lyra inquired, her tone dripping with feigned commiseration. "I understand this must be trying, but certain connections, well, they are simply destined for something greater, for magnificence." She touched Kale's chest, a gesture of absolute dominion, and some are not. The words were like poisoned darts, each one delivered with a cruel little smirk. Arya's sole focus now was to endure this encounter, to deny her sister the satisfaction of witnessing her utter collapse. She lifted her chin, her voice strained. "I am overjoyed for both of you." Lyra's smile was one of patronizing condescension. "Naturally you are. It is for the best, truly. Kale requires a robust partner, someone not intimidated by the spotlight." She leaned closer, her voice a venomous whisper. "Do not fret, my dear sister. Perhaps a wolf from the border patrol will take a liking to you. You simply need to learn your proper place within the shadows." And that was it. The final, devastating blow. The last vestiges of Arya's composure crumbled into dust. A single, burning tear, born of pure fury and despair, escaped. And in the muted light, she perceived the glint of triumph in Lyra's eyes. She had won. But then Lyra's expression shifted. Her smug smile froze. Her eyes widened in astonishment, perhaps even alarm. Without preamble, the atmosphere surrounding them grew heavy, frigid. The clamor of the grand hall seemed to recede into a distant hum. As if drawn by an unseen thread, Arya turned. The Alpha King was no longer seated on his throne. He was descending the steps. Each movement was measured, deliberate, powerful, and he was moving directly towards her. The low vibration escalated into a thunderous roar. It consumed him. 10 years of silence, 10 years of ironclad restraint, 10 years of a numbing, hollow peace. All of it fractured in the span of a single heartbeat. His wolf, the beast he had starved, caged, and attempted to extinguish, was now awake, and it desired her. His mind shrieked a command to cease, to resume his seat, to reclaim command. This was madness. A sovereign did not act on impulse. A sovereign did not betray emotion. A sovereign did not feel, yet his body was no longer his own. He rose from his throne. The grating sound of stone against stone was lost in the sudden, roaring silence of his own consciousness. He registered the astonished gazes of his council, the bewilderment of the entire assembly, but they were utterly insignificant. The only tangible reality was the maiden in the shadows, and the primal, undeniable imperative resonating through his very being. Mine. He walked. He had no recollection of initiating the movement, yet his feet carried him down the steps, across the stone floor, his eyes fixed upon her. The cruel sister and the pathetic beta heir remained frozen, their mouths agape in astonishment. He paid them no mind. They were but gnats. He halted before her, the shattered, exquisite she-wolf, with tears on her face. He could detect her profound sorrow, her defiant spirit, her anguish, and beneath it all, something else, something that resonated with the very core of his being. The world held its breath. He lowered himself, his voice not his own, but the deep, guttural rumble of the beast he had long suppressed. "You are not unchosen," he growled. The words were a sacred pledge, a declaration of ownership, a final decree. "You are mine." The ensuing silence was so absolute, so profound, it possessed a resonance of its own. The monster had finally awakened, and it had just claimed its mate. The words had been spoken, uttered by him, and the subsequent silence was a living entity, a terrifying force that swallowed every sound within the grand hall. In that moment, he experienced a disorienting schism. The king, the cold, rational ruler he had painstakingly constructed, was screaming within the confines of his own ribcage, desperately clawing for control. But the wolf was exulting in triumph. It had tasted freedom for the first time in a decade, and it would not be shackled again. Hundreds of eyes were fixed upon him, wide with shock, apprehension, and incredulity. He felt their judgment like a tangible weight. He's lost his senses. The king has gone mad. To exacerbate matters, his own councilmen were staring at him, their faces ashen. What he had just done transcended a mere breach of decorum. It was an act of rebellion against his own established laws, the very laws for which he had shed blood. And he had done it for her. The maiden, his intended companion, was gazing at him, her eyes vast pools of sheer terror. She did not regard him as a savior. No, she viewed him as her executioner. Deep down, he acknowledged the grim truth. Perhaps he was. Before he could react, before his rational mind could reassert its dominance and attempt to salvage this disastrous predicament, his body acted on pure instinct. The wolf was now in command. He advanced, the space between them crackling with an unseen energy, palpable to all. He extended his hand. It was not a request. It was an imperative. "Come," he commanded, his voice a low growl that reverberated through the deathly silent hall. Her breath hitched for a fleeting instant. He anticipated her flight. He saw it in the frantic darting of her eyes, the tremor in her limbs. On the other hand, where could she possibly escape to? He had just claimed her before the eyes of the entire world. There was no recourse from him now. With a shudder that racked her entire frame, she placed her small, trembling hand into his. The instant their skin met, a surge of pure, incandescent energy coursed up his arm, striking directly at the heart of the wolf. It was a feeling of profound rightness, of returning home. It was the most terrifying sensation he had ever experienced. Without another word, he turned and began to walk, drawing her along with him. The throng parted before them like a frightened sea, their whispers hissing in his wake. He did not look back. He could not, for if he did, the king might comprehend the devastation he had just wrought upon his meticulously ordered kingdom. His voice, and it was far more than mere sound she perceived with her ears. It was a deep resonance she felt within her very being, a vibration that shook her to her core. "You are mine." The world spun precariously. Time ceased its passage. No, no, no. This was a horrific delusion, a cruel, twisted jest. Her thoughts swirled in a dizzying vortex of terror. The Alpha King did not behave in such a manner. He was the embodiment of the Ice King, a wolf who had remained emotionally inert for years. Everyone knew the accounts of the devastating tragedy that had frozen his heart. He forged political alliances, not impassioned claims, in the midst of a solemn ceremony. What had she done to merit such a fate? Was this a retribution for her tears? For her perceived weakness? She was uncertain which prospect instilled greater dread, the scrutiny of hundreds of eyes suddenly fixed upon her, or the piercing gaze of two golden orbs that seemed to penetrate her very soul. The pity she had endured all evening had vanished. In its place, fear and suspicion were evident. She saw it reflected on every face. She was no longer the ostracized maiden. She was the king's folly. Then she saw Lyra. Her sister's face, which had moments before radiated with triumphant glee, was now contorted into an expression of pure, homicidal fury. The hatred burning in her eyes was so potent, so absolute, it felt like a physical assault. In a single, decisive moment, the world shifted, and Arya understood with chilling certainty that her life was irrevocably over in more ways than one. Before she could react, the king extended his hand. It was a divine decree, and she was merely mortal. Her body moved on pure instinct. Her trembling hand rose to meet his. The instant their skin touched, a conflagration erupted beneath her skin, a shocking, possessive warmth that traveled up her arm and directly into her chest. It was not a comforting warmth. It was a searing brand, an indelible claim. Her own wolf, which had been whimpering in a secluded corner of her soul all night, stirred and responded with a silent howl of its own. He drew her forward, and she stumbled in his wake. The procession through the grand hall felt like the longest journey of her existence. The silence was deafening, broken only by the frantic pounding of her own heart. They were a spectacle, a king and his captive. She kept her gaze fixed on the floor, unable to withstand the weight of their stares. Eventually, they emerged into the biting night air, the scent of rain and damp earth filling her lungs. Guards opened the door to a colossal black carriage, emblazoned with the royal crest, a snarling silver wolf. He guided her inside, his touch firm, inescapable, and then the door slammed shut, plunging them into an intimate, suffocating darkness. She was ensnared, trapped with him. The darkness within the carriage offered a measure of respite. Simultaneously, it presented a new form of confinement. The confined space felt oppressive, and her scent, a blend of rain-kissed blossoms and unadulterated terror, permeated the air, clouding his thoughts. The wolf within him settled, a low purr now rumbling in his chest, content in her proximity, enclosed with him. But the king was gradually regaining his composure, and the sheer magnitude of his rashness descended upon him. What had he done? He had disregarded a century of tradition, undermined his own authority, and signaled to his adversaries that he was governed by impulse, that he was weak, all due to a primal draw towards a maiden he barely knew. She was huddled in the far corner of the velvet seat, attempting to render herself as inconspicuous as possible. He could discern her ragged breaths. Her fear was a palpable entity within the confined space separating them. To be perfectly honest, he had no idea how to rectify this situation. "I will not harm you," he stated, the words sounding hollow, absurd. He was the most formidable wolf on the continent, and he had just forcibly removed her from her life. She flinched at the sound of his voice. "What? What do you want with me?" she whispered, her voice quivering. What did he want? The wolf desired to claim her, to mark her, to confine her within his mountain fortress, and forbid anyone else from ever casting their gaze upon her again. The king wished to undo the preceding 10 minutes, to reincarcerate the monstrous entity and restore order. "There is a connection between us," he declared, forcing the words out. They tasted like ash, an ancient affinity. "My wolf recognized you." More significantly, it had awakened for her. It was a meager explanation, the sort of fanciful lore he had always dismissed as childish fables. Yet it was the sole truth he possessed. "A bond?" she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "But that is impossible. You are the Alpha King." As if his title rendered him impervious to such phenomena. Perhaps it should have. "What is your name?" he inquired, shifting the subject. Because if he were compelled to continue discussing the bond, he feared he might genuinely descend into madness. "Arya," she whispered. "Arya Vale." Arya. Her name lingered in the air between them. The wolf found the sound pleasing. Of course it did. "Where are you taking me?" she inquired, her voice imbued with slightly more resolve. "To my domain, to the Icefang Citadel." He had no choice but to escort her there, as it was the most secure stronghold within the kingdom. Consequently, it was the only location where he could guarantee her safety and the security of his catastrophic secret. The carriage jolted forward, its wheels finding purchase on the slick cobblestones, signifying that there was no turning back. He had asserted his claim. He had taken her. He had ignited a flame that would either warm his frozen kingdom or reduce it to ashes. And as he observed the silhouette of the terrified maiden opposite him, one certainty solidified within him. He was no longer a king of ice. He was the custodian of a flickering ember, and he would eliminate anyone who dared to extinguish it. The passage was a disorienting blur of darkness and fear, and the rhythmic sway of the carriage was the sole anchor grounding her in reality. By the time they came to a halt, the moon hung high and frigid in a starless sky, seemingly observing her. The carriage door swung open, and the initial sensation that assailed her was the air. It possessed a distinct quality here, thin, sharp, and so intensely cold it felt akin to inhaling pulverized glass. And then she beheld it. It was not a castle. It was a mountain sculpted into the semblance of a nightmare. The ice-fanged citadel pierced the heavens, a formidable bastion of black stone and iridescent ice, its spires resembling daggers aimed at the heart of the moon. It was breathtaking, terribly so, a domain of silent, absolute authority. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was not a dwelling, it was a mausoleum. Without a word, the king disembarked, his presence somehow amplified, more menacing in the biting wind. He turned and regarded her, his golden eyes glowing in the darkness. He did not extend his hand this time. Instead, he simply waited, a silent command. Follow. And she complied. What alternative did she possess? Within, the citadel was even more frigid. Her footsteps echoed through the vast, cavernous hall. The sound was absorbed by the shadows that danced between colossal stone pillars. A stern-faced woman with silver hair, pulled into a severe knot, met them, her gaze flickering towards Arya with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation before she offered a deep bow to the king. Ensure she has all her necessities, Lucian commanded, his voice reverberating off the stone. She is to be accommodated in the queen's quarters. The queen's quarters? The words felt like a cruel mockery. Arya led her through an endless procession of hushed corridors, her expression a mask of cool professionalism. The chambers she was shown were magnificent, exceeding the size of her entire family's home. A fire blazed in an immense hearth. A bed was adorned with silks the color of cream, and jewels glittered from a vanity table. It was a gilded cage. Eventually, Arya departed, leaving her alone in the oppressive, opulent silence. She approached a towering mirror and gazed at her reflection. She saw a maiden with wild eyes and a torn garment, a spectral presence haunting a palace. She did not belong here. She was a captive. Later, she could not ascertain how much later, she overheard hushed, urgent voices from the corridor. "The king's curse," one servant whispered. "Hush! Do you wish for the king to overhear you?" the other hissed back. "He has not been right since the great tragedy. His wolf has been dormant for 10 years until she arrived." Her breath caught in her throat. His wolf dormant. A shiver, entirely unrelated to the cold, traced its way down her spine. What manner of monster had she been bound to? A king devoid of soul, of wolf, of heart, and somehow she was the catalyst who had awakened the beast. The notion was so horrifying that she had to grip the vanity to prevent herself from collapsing. Silence, control, order. These were the foundational tenets of his existence, the very bedrock of his dominion. And now they were irrevocably lost. He occupied his private study, a glass of amber liquid untouched on his desk. He attempted to focus on the trade ledgers before him, but the ink swam before his eyes. For all he could perceive, all he could sense, was her. She was on the opposite side of the citadel, yet it felt as though she were breathing the same air. The wolf, his wolf, paced restlessly in the recesses of his mind. It was no longer a distant murmur. It was a living, breathing presence, and it was insistent. Go to her, see her, ensure her safety. It was infuriating. It was maddening. This pervasive sensation, this constant distracting pull, was a vulnerability he could not afford. For this reason, he had to contain it. He summoned Arya, his voice sharp. "Lady Arya," he began, his tone brooking no argument. "She is to be treated with the utmost honor, as a most esteemed guest. She shall have anything she desires, sustenance, attire, reading materials, but under no circumstances is she to depart the Queen's wing. Is that understood?" "Yes, Your Majesty," Arya replied, bowing, her expression inscrutable. He was confining his attendant within a cage to prevent his own primal entity from breaking free from its restraint. It was a logical course of action. It was necessary. So why did it feel so profoundly wrong? To further complicate matters, his council demanded an audience. He anticipated their request before they even voiced it. Lord Valerius, an elder wolf whose lineage had served the throne for generations, stepped forward as their spokesperson. "Your Majesty," he commenced, his voice a low, respectful growl, "the packs are in a state of disquiet. The events of the ceremony, your declaration, it was an emotionally driven display. The laws governing arranged unions exist for a crucial purpose, to maintain societal equilibrium, to prevent the infiltration of weakness into the bloodlines." Lucian's jaw clenched. "Come to the point, Valerius." Valerius inhaled deeply. "You must publicly disavow the maiden. Form a proper alliance with the Stonecrest pack. The Alpha possessed a daughter of suitable age for marriage. This was the sole recourse to silence the murmurs of your perceived frailty." A low, rumbling growl erupted through the chamber before he could suppress it. It was not his own voice. It was the collective cry of the wolves. Valeria's and the other council members recoiled, their faces etched with apprehension. The atmosphere grew heavy. The raw power emanating from Lucian became overwhelming. He rose deliberately from his seat, his palms pressed flat against the desk, to restrain himself from surging forward. "Arya Vale belongs to me," he rasped, his voice a chilling fusion of sovereign and beast. "Her destiny is mine to determine, and you shall never again allude to her as a vulnerability. Now, depart." They practically scrambled from the room. He remained standing, his chest heaving, the sheer, untamed ferocity vibrating through his very being. He had just protected her. He had just prioritized her above the very stability of his own dominion. What unprecedented shift was occurring within him? Just as his breathing began to steady, a guard entered, appearing apprehensive. "Your Majesty, a visitor has arrived at the gates. She is adamant." Lucian's gaze sharpened. "Who?" "Lady Lyra Vale," the guard stated, and a chill coursed through him. "She insists on seeing her sister." The rapping on her chamber door startled her. It was Lyra, her expression as impassive as ever. "You have a visitor, my lady." A visitor? A minuscule, delicate ember of hope flickered within her. Had her pack dispatched someone for her? Was Kale present as well? "Lady Lyra awaits you in the winter sitting room," Arya informed her, and the fragile hope disintegrated into a cascade of icy fragments. "Lyra, here." No. The winter sitting room was as frigid as its appellation suggested. Every surface was adorned in white and silver, a stark and lifeless beauty, as if carved from a glacier. And at its heart, reclining on a silken divan, was Lyra. She appeared perfectly at ease, a toxic blossom unfurling amidst the frost. "Sister," Lyra pronounced, her smile utterly devoid of warmth. "I felt compelled to come. I was so concerned about you being forcibly removed like that. Are you well? Is he treating you kindly?" The questions, cloaked in the guise of concern, were in reality surgical instruments designed to dissect and wound. Arya's objective was straightforward. Endure. Do not betray your distress. "I am well," she replied, her voice barely audible. Lyra let out a delicate peal of laughter, a sound like tinkling icicles that sent shivers down Arya's spine. "Oh, Arya, you are a poor dissembler, but I suppose I cannot fault you. This must be rather daunting." She gestured around the room. "It is a magnificent enclosure. I will grant him that. Nevertheless, a cage remains a cage." She stood and began to circle Arya as a predator might stalk its prey. "Tell me, does he permit you to wander the gardens, or does he keep his new acquisition on a very tight tether?" "He is the king," Arya managed, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "He is a monster," Lyra corrected, her voice lowering to a venomous hiss. "A cold, hollow entity that has felt nothing for a decade, and you? You are a fleeting diversion, a curiosity." She stopped directly before Arya, her eyes hard as polished diamonds. "Do you truly believe this will endure? He will grow weary of you, just as Kale did. This is your ordained purpose, little sister, to be cast aside." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow, stealing the very air from her lungs. She stumbled backward, the familiar pang of shame, the gnawing sensation of worthlessness engulfing her. She opened her mouth to utter a retort, anything at all, but no sound emerged. Lyra smiled, a slow, triumphant curve of her lips. She had triumphed once more. "Savor your time within the castle," she purred, turning and sweeping from the room, leaving Arya trembling in the frozen quiet. But the silence was ephemeral. In the stillness that followed, she sensed it, a presence. The air grew heavy, charged with a palpable danger. Her head snapped up, her gaze drawn to the arched entryway where Lyra had just vanished. He was there, Lucian, standing as a monolith sculpted from shadow and wrath, his golden eyes blazing with an intensity that was anything but frigid. And the most unsettling thought of all dawned upon her. How much had he overheard? He stood in the doorway, a tempest contained within human form. Lyra's cloying perfume still tainted the air, an offense to his senses, yet his focus was solely on Arya. She was quivering, her complexion ashen, her spirit appearing as delicate as a frost-kissed leaf. And the wolf within him, the one she had awakened, raged. It raged against Lyra for daring to touch what was his. It raged against the cosmos for bestowing upon this girl the key to his very soul. And it raged against himself, Lucian, the king, for his perceived failing. Without a word, he strode into the room, his boots echoing like hammer blows on the marble flooring. The silence stretched, thick and oppressive. He stopped before her, so close he could feel the frantic thrumming of her pulse. "You will not permit her to address you in such a manner," he commanded, his voice offering no solace, only an unyielding decree. "Never again?" Arya flinched, her eyes wide with a bewilderment that only amplified his ire. Did she not comprehend? Her vulnerability was a beacon, a target painted upon his back. Her anguish was a weapon his adversaries could wield against him. She is my sister," Arya stammered, her voice a mere whisper. "She is a viper," he growled, his self-control fracturing. "And this citadel is their nest. Should you exhibit fear, they will strike, and their venom will become my burden." Before he could rein himself in, his frustration erupted. He grasped her arm, his grip firm, intending to shake some sense into her, to make her grasp the peril. "You are mine now. Your weakness reflects upon me. Do you comprehend?" He sought to impart the wisdom of combat, of survival in this savage world he had thrust her into. Yet he knew only the lexicon of dominion and subjugation, for empathy had been incinerated within him long ago. The instant his fingers encircled her arm, it occurred. Fire. A surge of pure, unrestrained energy coursed between them. A jolt so potent it felt akin to lightning ensnared beneath the skin. His breath hitched. Her gasp was a sharp, wounded sound. The air crackled, charged with a power entirely divorced from fury and intimately connected to their burgeoning bond. His grip, intended to intimidate, now felt like an anchor. He could not release her. He would not. The wolf purred, a deep, possessive rumble resonating in his chest. "Mate." Amidst the stunning, ringing silence, he looked down at his hand on her arm, then back up at her terrified, exquisite face. Her lips were parted in a silent "oh" of shock. What had he wrought? This was not control. This was pandemonium. And as the connection pulsed between them, burning and undeniable, he grasped a truth that terrified him more than any potential rebellion. He never wished to relinquish her grasp. Ever. She fled. The instant he released her arm and stormed from the room, leaving her with the phantom sensation of that fiery touch searing her skin, she ran. Her heart pounded a frantic tattoo against her ribs, fleeing from Lyra's cruelty, from Lucian's terrifying fury, from that inexplicable sensation. No matter how fiercely she struggled, she could not escape it. It felt as though his brand was now imprinted upon her very soul. She had no destination in mind. Her feet carried her through the frigid, silent corridors of the citadel, past stern-faced guards, who averted their gazes, and tapestries depicting ancient, bloody conflicts. This entire edifice was a testament to mortality and subjugation. It suffocated her. She yearned for air. She craved a solitary haven that felt imbued with life. As if guided by an invisible thread, she found herself in an unfamiliar sector of the castle. Down a long, disused passageway, she noticed a door fashioned from dark wood and frosted glass, and from it emanated a faint, impossible warmth. Hesitantly, she pushed it open, and her breath hitched. She stepped from the cold stone into a realm of vibrant, improbable existence. It was a colossal conservatory, a hidden jungle enclosed beneath a vaulted glass canopy. The air was dense and humid, perfumed with damp earth, nocturnal jasmine, and the very essence of life. Water trickled from a small stone fountain at its center. Verdant foliage cascaded from the walls. It was a secret garden, a sanctuary. Tears she hadn't realized she was withholding finally streamed down, silent rivulets on her chilled cheeks. She sank onto a stone bench near the fountain, the sound of dripping water a soothing balm to her frayed nerves. Perhaps fate had guided her here. Here, she was not the discarded maiden nor the king's captive. She was simply Arya. "It belonged to my mother," a low voice declared from the doorway. She gasped, her head snapping up. Lucian stood there, not as a monarch or a tempest, but as a shadow observing her from the periphery of the light. He made no move to enter, as if sensing his presence would shatter the tranquility of this place. "She was the only one who could coax life from this frozen rock," he continued, his voice softer than she had ever perceived it. He took a hesitant step inside. "She said it was the only place within the citadel that recalled the sun's embrace." In the ensuing quiet, the tension from their earlier confrontation gradually dissipated, supplanted by a fragile, tentative accord. I am sorry," she whispered, uncertain of the nature of her apology. For her weakness? For her very existence? He finally drew nearer, halting a few feet from her bench. "What did she say to you before I arrived?" The question was direct, yet devoid of its former harshness. She met his golden gaze and perceived, for the very first time, not a monster, but a wolf burdened by a profound and desolate solitude, and her own heart ached in resonance. "She told me I was a fleeting distraction," Arya confessed, her voice trembling. "That you would grow weary of me, and that I was destined to be set aside." A flicker of something dark and menacing ignited in his eyes, but his voice remained steady. "She was mistaken." "How do you know?" The question was a raw plea. He remained silent for a long moment, the only sound the gentle trickle of the fountain. "Because," he finally uttered, his voice barely a whisper, "my wolf, the part of me that feels, that connects, has been dormant for 10 years. Dead. I believed it was gone forever." He looked at her, and the weight of his stare was immense. "Until the moment I saw you weeping in the shadows. Your pain. It was like a thunderclap that awakened the dead." Her world seemed to spin. He was offering her a fragment of his shattered spirit. It was the most precious, most terrifying gift she had ever received. Without conscious thought, as if her hand possessed a volition of its own, she extended it, not to touch him, but as a simple gesture, an offering of solace. He took a step closer, his gaze fixed on hers, and then he did something that dismantled the last of her defenses. He reached out and, with exquisite gentleness, tucked a stray lock of her hair behind her ear. His fingers brushed against her cheek, a touch as delicate as a moth's wing. Yet it ignited her entire nervous system. It was an act of such simple, profound intimacy that it left her breathless. The king of ice and shadow had just revealed that he too remembered the sun. He departed the conservatory, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. What was that? That tenderness. He had imparted a truth he had never vocalized to another living soul. And her response, that flicker of understanding, of empathy, had unnerved him more than any army. He had allowed her to glimpse the crack in his formidable armor. That gentle moment, the sensation of her soft skin beneath his fingers, had shaken him to his very core. He strode through the halls, his mind a chaotic whirlwind. He needed to regain control, to recoat his veins with ice. Duty, that was the solution. He would lose himself in the administration of his kingdom, for that was a realm he understood implicitly. He found Lord Grior, his spy master, awaiting him in his solar, and the expression on the old wolf's face was grim. "Your Majesty," Grior stated, his voice low, "the whispers have coalesced into a plan." Lucian's blood ran cold. "Explain." "Lady Lyra and the beta heir Kale are not merely fomenting dissent. They have been meeting in secret with the alphas of the Blood Moon and Stonefang packs," Gregor reported, his words clipped and precise. "They are forging a coalition. They are leveraging your connection to Lady Arya as their rallying cry." "What are they proclaiming?" Lucian demanded, his voice a low growl. Grior hesitated. "They are asserting that the king's intellect is compromised, that an emotional attachment has rendered you unstable, unfit to govern. They are distorting our statutes, claiming your tenuous bond is a curse, not a boon. They intend to challenge your claim to the throne at the next full moon." The fragile warmth from the conservatory evaporated, replaced by a rage so frigid it felt like ice flooding his veins. They were weaponizing her. They were twisting this pure, improbable phenomenon that had roused him from a decade of slumber into a tool. A weapon aimed directly at his heart and his crown. For 10 years, he had governed through logic and dread. He had transformed himself into a monster to safeguard his realm. But now they threatened the one entity, the one individual who had rekindled his wolfish essence. In that instant, a decision solidified within his mind, sharp and clear as a shard of ice. He had been concealing her, attempting to shield his perceived vulnerability. But that was Lyra's strategy, a game of shadows and insinuation. He would not partake. Instead, he would execute the very act they would least anticipate. He would not conceal his vulnerability. He would place her upon a throne and dare them to challenge him. He turned to his aide, who stood waiting by the door. "Merrick," he commanded, his voice resonating with an authority that had long been absent. "Prepare the grand hall for a formal banquet this evening. Dispatch invitations to every attending lord and lady." He paused, his golden eyes blazing. "Lady Arya will be my companion," signifying that the game would no longer unfold in the shadows. It would commence in the light for the entire world to witness. The gowns arrived like a death knell. All and 2 other attendants entered her chambers, their arms laden with silks and velvets in the deep, imposing hues of the royal lineage, charcoal gray, blood red, and silver. They arranged them upon her bed, a shimmering shroud for the girl she once was. "The king requests your presence at a formal banquet this evening," Arya announced, her voice flat, betraying nothing. "He desires you to be attired fittingly for your station." Her station, a captive, a pet, a weakness. The words of the council, of Lyra, of Lucian himself, swirled within her mind. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed its way up her throat. I cannot," she stammered, shaking her head as she retreated. "I cannot go out there. They all despise me." Arya's expression softened momentarily, a flicker of something akin to pity. "It is not a request, my lady." No, it was an imperative. He was compelling her into the arena, into the viper's nest he had cautioned her about. Deep within, she recognized the truth. He was testing her, and she was destined to falter. But then she recalled the conservatory. She remembered the look in his eyes when he spoke of his silent wolf, the impossible softness of his fingers against her cheek. He had not merely witnessed her pain, he had unveiled his own, and something within her shifted. This was no longer solely about her survival. It was about his. "The red one," she stated, her voice small but resolute. If she was to be a sacrifice, she would at least resemble a flame. An hour later, she was a stranger in her own skin. The crimson silk gown felt like protective armor, and the silver necklace adorning her throat felt like a manacle. When Lucian arrived at her door to escort her, he halted abruptly. He spoke no word, but his golden eyes blazed with an intensity that stole the very air from her lungs. Without a sound, he offered her his arm. His touch was electric, a surge of raw power that coursed directly to her core, and she yielded. She allowed it to steady her. With each measured step, they took down the long corridor towards the grand hall. Her terror escalated. The distant murmur of voices intensified, a predatory beast poised to consume her. But as they reached the imposing doors, she felt his hand tighten on hers. It was the sole reassurance she would receive. The doors swung open, and the world fell silent. Every lord and lady within the hall turned, their conversation ceasing mid-utterance. The silence was a palpable blow, a wall of judgment and animosity. She could feel their stares like 1,000 tiny needles. Her initial impulse was to avert her gaze, to conceal herself. But then she felt Lucian's presence beside her, an edifice of unyielding strength. "Your weakness reflects upon me." "No, not tonight." She lifted her chin. She surveyed the throng of hostile faces, the calculating gaze of Lord Valeria's, the undisguised, venomous astonishment on her sister's features. And she did not falter. In that singular moment, she was no longer merely Arya Vale, the scorned maiden. She was the woman standing beside the Alpha King, and she would not be subjugated. He sensed her fear as if it were his own, a frantic avian fluttering against his ribs. Yet, as the doors opened and silence descended, he perceived something else emanating from her, a glint of resolve, a spark of defiance. When her chin lifted, a fierce, possessive pride surged through him, so potent it nearly elicited a growl. This was his mate. They proceeded to the high table. Each step was a calculated act of aggression. He seated her in the chair adjacent to his, the one that had remained vacant for a decade. The message was unequivocal. The murmurs commenced then, a venomous hiss that slithered through the hall. He disregarded them. Let them converse. Let them plot. Tonight, they would apprehend the essence of true dominion. The banquet was an agonizing ballet of false pleasantries and veiled barbs. He could feel the tension coil tighter and tighter within the room with each passing moment, and he knew it was on the verge of snapping. Ultimately, Lord Malachi of the Stonefang pack, one of Lyra's newfound allies, rose to his feet, a goblet of wine in his hand. "A toast," he declared, his voice sufficiently resonant to command the assembly's attention. "To the king." The wolves all drank, but Malachi was not finished. "And to the laws that have preserved our kingdom's integrity," he continued, his gaze fixed upon Lucian, "laws that prioritize strength and stability over ephemeral affections." The insult was blatant. The gauntlet had been thrown, the air grew heavy, and the room held its collective breath. The wolf within Lucian yearned to cross the room and rend the man's throat asunder, but the king harbored a more judicious plan. Slowly, deliberately, he rose to his feet. He did not address Malachi directly. Instead, he turned his gaze to Arya. "Lord Malachi speaks of strength," Lucian intoned, his voice a low, dangerous calm, far more terrifying than any bellow. "For 10 years, I have governed this realm with a fortitude born of ice, a fortitude forged in control, a fortitude stemming from an empty heart." He paused, allowing his words to resonate. "I was mistaken." Then he reached out and placed his hand upon Arya's shoulder. He allowed the bond to flare. He did not merely permit them to observe it, he compelled them to experience it. A wave of raw, untamed, possessive power washed through the hall. It carried the scent of lightning, the heat of a conflagration, the resonance of a deity's very heartbeat. It was ancient and primal, a force that reverberated through every wolf in the room, shaking them to their core. The goblets trembled in their hands. The ladies paled, the lords instinctively bared their teeth in submission. "This is not an ephemeral affection," Lucian growled, his golden eyes blazing as he surveyed the stunned assembly. "This is not a weakness. This is a rediscovered bond. This is the magic that shaped our people. It is a strength you have all forgotten." He leaned down, his voice dropping to a possessive whisper audible to all as he gazed at Arya. "And she is its very heart." He resumed his seat, his gaze sweeping over the unnerved visages. He had not raised his voice. He had not issued a threat, yet he had effectively won the conflict. Or so he believed, for when his eyes met Lyra's across the room, he detected no fear. He perceived a hatred so profound, so absolute, that it portended a far bloodier confrontation to come. The residual exhilaration from the grand hall had dissipated, leaving in its wake a profound, trembling weariness. He had stood as her protector. He had done more than merely stake his claim to her. He had proclaimed her the very fount of his newfound fortitude. Her heart throbbed with an emotion both terrifying and exquisite, one she couldn't quite articulate. He stood by the hearth, his back turned to her, one hand propped against the stone fireplace. The facade of rigid self-control had reasserted itself, yet she could perceive the tautness in the set of his shoulders. The performance had concluded, and the man beneath had been revealed. "Why?" she breathed into the prevailing stillness. He did not turn. Understanding was paramount. "No," she stated, taking a tentative step closer. "Not that. Why was your wolf so quiet?" It was imperative that she comprehend. She had to grasp the man who had just upended his entire existence for her. For a protracted interval, she feared he would offer no reply. The fire crackled merrily, sending sparks dancing onto the hearth. When he finally broke his silence, his voice was roughened by a sorrow so ancient it sounded like the erosion of stone. "Because I extinguished it," he stated, "or at least I endeavored to." He turned then, and in the dancing firelight she glimpsed the phantom of a younger wolf in his gaze, a soul burdened by an unhealed sorrow. "Years ago, before I ascended to the throne, I was a different man. I felt everything too acutely: love, ardor, fury." He recounted to her the narrative, the saga of a profound tragedy. He spoke of a love that defied boundaries, a clandestine romance with the daughter of a rival alpha, of a clandestine rendezvous, of a moment of unguarded passion that had inadvertently guided his family's adversaries directly to their doorstep. He described the ambush, the inferno, the harrowing discovery of his parents' lifeless forms amidst the smoldering wreckage of their home. "My emotions were their undoing," he confessed, his voice faltering on the final word. A single, perfect tear escaped his eye, not born of sadness, but of a decade of unadulterated, seething self-reproach. "And so, I swore an oath upon their ashes. I would never again be vulnerable. I would sever my own heart, starve my own wolf, and become the unyielding monarch of ice and stone they required." Her chest ached in sympathy, a poignant echo of his own profound suffering. This, she realized, was the genesis of his harshness, his meticulous control, his pervasive solitude. It was all a carefully constructed bulwark. Acting on pure instinct, her body moved without conscious thought. She closed the distance between them, and before he could retreat, she gently laid her hand over his heart. She could feel its rapid, unsteady pulse beneath her palm. "You are not made of stone," she murmured. His breath caught. He glanced down at her hand resting upon his chest, then raised his gaze to meet hers, his golden eyes searching hers with an intense scrutiny. The atmosphere grew heavy, the space between them charged with all the unspoken words, the shared anxieties, the hard-won triumphs, and the profound, mutual ache of grief. And then he moved. In the space of a single heartbeat, the world around them irrevocably transformed. His hand rose to cup her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek as he leaned in, his lips colliding with hers. It was not a tender caress. It was a raw, desperate clash. It was a decade of self-denial and a lifetime of isolation poured into a single, searing, searching embrace. It was the monarch of ice claiming his flame, not with an imperious command, but with a heartfelt plea. It tasted of embers and amber spirits, and a hope so improbable it felt like a miracle. And as she returned his kiss, infusing him with all her own fractured fragments, she knew, with absolute certainty, that this was the irreversible turning point. For a week, the world existed as a delicate, breathtaking dream. After that momentous night, after that earth-shattering kiss, a profound thaw had begun within the citadel and within him. The hushed conversations that permeated the corridors had not ceased, but they were now tinged with a potent blend of apprehension and reverence rather than mere disdain. Lucian did not sequester her away. Instead, he kept her close. They shared meals, strolled the castle ramparts beneath the stark, cold stars, and sat in companionable silence beside the fire in his private chambers. He never revisited his past again, nor did he ever again touch her with that desperate, consuming fire. Yet, the way he looked at her was a perpetual, smoldering caress. For the first time since her heart had been shattered, she felt a stirring of hope, a perilous, awe-inspiring, and utterly wonderful hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, she was not destined to be relegated to the sidelines. Today marked the grand tournament, a vibrant celebration of the autumn hunt. Brilliant pennants fluttered in the breeze. The air was perfumed with the aroma of roasted wild boar and spiced wine, and the joyous sounds of laughter and cheers reverberated across the training grounds. She was seated in the royal viewing enclosure, a luxurious cloak of the king's silver and gray draped over her shoulders. Lucian stood beside her, radiating the quiet confidence of a king in his natural element, powerful yet at ease. What followed was a moment of such profound perfection, such exquisite simplicity, that it brought an ache to her very core. He leaned down, his voice a low murmur intended solely for her ears. "Are you warm enough?" Before she could formulate a response, a sudden commotion erupted from below. A man's scream pierced the air, a strangled, choking sound. The crowd recoiled in a collective gasp, stumbling backward. Lord Theron, the formidable alpha of the Silver Creek pack, and one of Lucian's most steadfast and devoted allies, lay sprawled on the ground. He was writhing, his face contorted into a ghastly cyan hue. A silver goblet had slipped from his grasp. Chaos erupted. Shouts mingled with the frantic movements of guards, and panic spread like wildfire through the festive gathering. Ariel's heart lurched into her throat. She rose, her hands gripping the railing, her eyes wide with uncomprehending horror. Beside her, Lucian was no longer the relaxed wolf. He was a monarch of ice and tempered steel, his eyes narrowed to slits, his entire being radiating a chilling, lethal authority. Then, a voice, sharp with practiced alarm, cut through the pandemonium. The goblet! It was Lyra. She pushed through the panicked throng, Kale at her side. Her countenance was a flawless mask of concern. She knelt beside the dying lord, her fingers hovering millimeters above the vessel. "There is something within it," she declared. "It smells of wolfsbane." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Wolfsbane, a poison so exceedingly rare, so devastatingly potent, that it could fell an alpha within mere seconds. "Where would anyone even procure such a substance?" Kyle inquired loudly, playing his part with consummate skill. Lyra straightened, her gaze sweeping across the assembled multitude before alighting with devastating, pinpoint accuracy upon Arya. Her expression conveyed a sorrowful, dawning realization. "The King's Arboretum," Lyra announced, her voice trembling with feigned grief. "It is the sole location within the kingdom where the plant is cultivated for medicinal purposes." Her gaze fixed directly on Arya, and in the span of a single breath, she had sealed her fate. "Lady Arya's private garden." The world fell into an unnerving silence. Every eye in the courtyard, hundreds upon hundreds, turned towards her. The warmth of their recent acceptance had vanished, replaced by a chilling, horrified suspicion. Her hope, her fragile, beautiful dream, was rapidly devolving into a terrifying nightmare. "She was jealous," a voice whispered from the crowd. "Lord Theron advised the king against the bond," another added. "She sought to eliminate a rival for his affections." The whispers escalated into a deafening roar of accusation. Her head spun. "No, no, this cannot be happening." Her eyes darted towards Lucian, a desperate plea in their depths, begging him to perceive the truth. But his face was an inscrutable mask of stone, his golden eyes darkened by a terrifying, ancient anguish. And then the guards began to advance, not to quell the surging crowd. No, they were moving towards her. Rage. It was a pure, cold, surgical thing. The instant he witnessed Theron's collapse, his mind had already begun its rapid calculations, assessing the unfolding threats. His primal instinct was to shield Arya, to extricate her from the ensuing pandemonium. But then Lyra's voice sliced through the air, and he understood that this was no random act of violence. This was a calculated move within a larger game, and it was a masterstroke. He observed her meticulously executing her role: the solicitous sister, the shrewd strategist, the arboretum. Of course, she had weaponized his mother's sanctuary, Arya's sole haven of peace. He had presented Arya to the court as a bastion of strength, and Lyra, with a single, devastating maneuver, had twisted her into a perpetrator. He saw the stark terror etched on Arya's face, her silent, desperate plea, and it felt like a dagger twisting in his gut. The wolf within him roared, a primal, savage, unending lament. Protect her, annihilate them all, incinerate this kingdom for her. But the king remembered a different conflagration. He recalled the acrid scent of burning timber and the ghastly tableau of his parents' lifeless forms. He remembered the devastating cost of a single lapse in emotional control, and the specters of his past rose, their icy grip tightening around his heart. The murmurs from the crowd were not merely accusations leveled against Arya. They were indictments against him. Your emotions have rendered you weak. Your bond has ushered in death. You failed to protect us, just as you did before. His council members gathered around him, their visages etched with grim concern. Your Majesty, Lord Valyria intoned, his voice low and urgent. You perceive now, the girl is a malignancy. The Pax will not countenance this. They will interpret this as a manifestation of your weakness, an inability to govern your consort. War will ensue. She is innocent, Lucian growled, the words tearing from his throat. It matters not, Valerius retorted. The evidence is irrefutable. Should you defend her now, you forfeit the throne. You relinquish all. You will be perceived as a monarch controlled by a murderous consort. And there it lay, the impossible dichotomy. His deepest, most paralyzing dread materialized. The woman who was his very soul, or the kingdom he had sworn upon his parents' graves to safeguard. His wolf howled, "Mate!" His duty thundered, "Kingdom!" The two fundamental aspects of his being were tearing him asunder. He gazed at Arya, standing solitary in the viewing box, the entire world arrayed against her. He saw the sheer terror in her eyes, but beneath it, he detected that flicker of resolve he had come to recognize. He had to make a choice, not as a wolf, not as a man, but as a sovereign. He turned to his royal guard, his expression a mask of cold, implacable ice. He allowed the silence to stretch, compelling the entire world to hang precariously on his next utterance. He let Arya witness him, the Ice King of legend, reborn in this crucible of crisis. And then he spoke, his voice devoid of all emotion, a command that resonated as a death sentence. "Confine her," he stated, the words leaving a taste of ash and blood. "To the dungeons." He watched the hope in her eyes shatter. He witnessed her face crumple as the guards seized her arms. He observed as they dragged his very soul away from him, and he remained there, a monarch carved from stone, as the monstrous entity he had so desperately striven to vanquish finally achieved its ultimate triumph. The darkness was absolute. It was a cold, damp, sentient presence that pressed in on her from every direction. The dungeon reeked of mildew and ancient stone, 1,000 years of forgotten despair. The persistent, rhythmic drip of water from an unseen source in the blackness was the sole auditory companion, a relentless torture that marked the passage of her new reality. They had relegated her not to a cell with a barred door, but to a chasm, a pit in the earth covered by a grate that served as its ceiling. "Confine her," the directive echoed in the suffocating silence. It was more than a mere command. It was a pronouncement of condemnation, a betrayal so profound, so absolute, that it had hollowed her out, leaving behind only a raw, aching void. The man who had embraced her with such desperate ardor, the man who had declared her the very heart of his strength, the one who had awakened her from her own prolonged slumber, had just cast her into the abyss. Her inherent flaw, The ugly, distorted conviction she had fought so fiercely to suppress surged forth and screamed at her within the darkness. Lyra was correct. Kale was correct. You were destined for obsolescence. You are utterly without worth. A transient distraction, a blight. She curled into a fetal position on the damp stone floor, a sob racking her frame, a raw, ragged sound that the oppressive darkness swallowed whole. She wept for the life she had lost, for the hope that had proven to be an elaborate deception, for the man who had saved her, only to become her ultimate tormentor. Her heart, which had begun to mend, was not merely broken now. It was annihilated. Nothing remained. All was lost. She had no sense of the passage of time, adrift in an ocean of her own despair. Minutes, or perhaps hours. But then something else began to stir within the emptiness. A faint flicker. It was not hope. Hope was the folly of the naive, a falsehood whispered in the light. No, this was something different, something more ancient and more resilient. Rage. A cold, quiet fury began to smolder in the depths of her being. The tear tracks on her face grew frigid. Her sobs subsided. The ceaseless dripping of water was no longer a torment. It was a catalyst for focus. She had been a victim her entire existence, a victim of her sister's machinations, a victim of a broken promise, a victim of a solitary king's curse. She had permitted their choices to dictate her fate, to shatter her spirit, and to discard her. No longer. She sat up in the darkness, her spine erect, her hands, which had been trembling, clenched into resolute fists. They could confine her to a pit. They could brand her a murderer. He could shatter her heart, but they would not break her spirit. Alone in the profound darkness, she made a solemn vow, not to a king, nor a mate, nor a deity. She made it to the final, stubborn ember of her own soul. I will not allow you to prevail, she whispered into the oppressive gloom, her voice no longer quivering, but resonating with the promise of a nascent inferno. I will not be set aside. And in the deepest, most desolate recess of the Ice-Fang citadel, a queen was born. The solar felt as if it were a mausoleum. He occupied his throne-like chair, a goblet of untouched wine clasped in his hand, presenting the perfect image of a broken monarch. Lyra and Kale stood before him, like vultures poised over fresh carrion. He had summoned them, and they had responded with eager alacrity, their faces barely concealing their smug satisfaction. His objective was deceptively straightforward. He had to embody the role they expected. The grieving consort, the compromised ruler, the gullible fool who had succumbed to emotion and forfeited all. For only in his perceived vulnerability would they betray the true extent of their avarice? You were correct, Lucian declared, his voice a hollow, lifeless echo. He allowed his gaze to drift towards the fire, as if unable to bear their scrutiny. The bond, it was a sickness. She has brought ruin to this court. Lyra's smile unfurled, a slow, venomous blossom. I am so very sorry, Your Majesty, she purred, her words dripping with feigned commiseration. I attempted to caution you. Some wolves are simply born to sow discord. What is it you desire, Lyra? He inquired, cutting through her charade with a weary sigh. Justice, Kyle proclaimed, stepping forward, his chest puffed out with an arrogant, newfound confidence. The Pax demand a trial, a public one. They must witness that the king's law is absolute, even when it touches his own heart. My heart. The wolf within him issued a low, murderous growl, which he ruthlessly suppressed. You understand nothing of my heart. A trial would prove arduous, Lucian murmured, continuing his pretense. Painful, yet necessary, Lyra insisted, her eyes glittering with avarice. To restore faith, the court must observe you irrevocably setting her aside. They must see you choose your kingdom over her. And there it was, the crux of their scheme. They did not merely desire Arya's demise. They wished for him to be the instrument of her emotional and spiritual annihilation before the eyes of the entire world. They sought to subjugate him, to demonstrate that his chosen path, the path of the bond, led only to ruin. "And thereafter?" he inquired, his voice flat. "After she is condemned?" Lyra drew nearer, her cloying floral scent permeating the air. "The kingdom will require stability, a new queen, one chosen by reason, not by some fleeting infatuation. The alliance with the Stonecrest pack remains a viable option, or a union between our two families could prove even more formidable." So that was the ultimate gambit. She not only coveted Arya's position, but the throne itself. Deep within, he acknowledged the stark truth. Her ambition was a bottomless abyss. He remained silent for a prolonged moment, allowing the tension to build. He swirled the wine in his goblet, observing the blood-red liquid clinging to the crystal. Then he raised his gaze, his countenance a mask of weary resignation. "Very well," he conceded, the words tasting of ash. "There shall be a public trial tomorrow at noon." He detected the fleeting glint of victory in their eyes, the shared, triumphant glance. They harbored the delusion that they had triumphed. They were fools. "You are dismissed." They practically floated from the chamber. The instant the heavy oak door clicked shut, the guise of the broken king evaporated. The ice in his eyes began to burn. He rose from his chair, not with weariness, but with the lethal grace of a predator. He strode to a section of the stone wall and pressed a concealed sigil. A panel slid inward, revealing a dark, narrow passage. Without a moment's hesitation, he stepped into the shadows. He had allowed the vipers to believe the lion was vanquished. Now it was time to unleash the wolf. Time spent within the darkness was an amorphous entity. She measured it by the slow, rhythmic cadence of dripping water, by the dull ache in her bones against the cold stone, by the persistent, burning hum of her own quiet fury. She had transcended tears, moved beyond despair. She was something else now, something harder, something forged in the crucible of betrayal and silence. Without warning, a sound disrupted the monotonous quietude, not the distant clang of a guard's boot, but a soft scraping noise emanating from the wall behind her. Her body tensed instantly, a growl rising in her throat. She rose to her feet, pressing herself against the opposite wall, her eyes straining in the absolute blackness. The scraping ceased. A moment later, a section of the damp stone wall shifted inward, revealing a sliver of flickering torchlight. A figure slipped through the opening, a tall, cloaked man holding a single torch. Her immediate impulse was to lunge, to engage in combat. "My lady," the man whispered, his voice rough, yet imbued with respect. He lowered his hood. "It is Merrick, the captain of Lucian's personal guard," revealing a wolf whose face was a road map of old scars. "I mean you no harm. I come on the king's orders." "The king's orders?" A bitter, sardonic laugh almost escaped her lips. Had he sent his executioner? "To finish the job?" she inquired, her voice raspy. Merrick's craggy face was etched with grim resolve. "No, my lady, to deliver this to you." He extended a small, tightly rolled piece of parchment, bound with a single black thread. She stared at it, her heart pounding with wild, frantic urgency. "What is this? Another stratagem? A final, cruel twist of the knife?" With trembling fingers, she accepted it. Her hands, clumsy in the darkness, managed to break the thread and unroll the rough paper. In the flickering light of the torch, she discerned a few lines penned in a sharp, familiar script. "The coldest steel is forged in the darkest fire. Be ready." That was all. A single sentence. But it altered everything. In the blink of an eye, the world around her transformed. This was not a betrayal. It was not an abandonment. It was a meticulously crafted plan, a terrifying, high-stakes gamble. He had not cast her to the wolves. He had thrust her into the furnace, confident that she would emerge as tempered steel. And the rage that had sustained her in the darkness now sharpened into a formidable weapon. Hope. Not the gentle, tender emotion she had previously experienced, but a hard, dangerous, and breathtaking hope erupted within her chest. "What does he wish for me to do?" she asked, her voice no longer the whisper of a victim, but the low, steady tone of a conspirator. "The trial is tomorrow at noon," Merrick stated, his voice urgent. "Lady Lyra will present her case. The king desires her too. He needs her to feel entirely secure, entirely triumphant. He then imparted a crucial piece of information, a detail concerning the poison known only to the king's inner circle, a question that only the guilty party would be incapable of answering correctly. He requires you to be the one who sets the trap. Can you accomplish this? Could she do it? Could she stand before the entire world and confront her sister, not as a victim, but as a queen? She gazed at the message in her hand, the words a silent pact between her and her king. "Inform him," she declared, her voice resonating with a strength she had never known she possessed, "that the steel is prepared." The air in the clandestine war room was thick with palpable tension. He stood before the select few wolves whose loyalty he trusted implicitly. Merrick, Gregor, his master of spies, and the alphas of two devoted packs who had arrived under the cloak of darkness. For the preceding 24 hours, they had all harbored the worst suspicions of him. They had all believed he had sacrificed his consort. Now they would learn the truth. "Lyra Vale believes she has achieved victory," Lucian began. His voice was a low, menacing rumble that echoed through the stone chamber. "She believes I am a broken man who would readily sacrifice his own mate to preserve his crown. She is about to discover the magnitude of her error." He meticulously outlined the plan. "Send only text, no instructions or comments. This is not a defensive strategy, but an offensive maneuver, a calculated trap." "The proceedings will continue," he declared, his eyes alight with a frigid intensity. "We shall permit Lyra to present her meticulously constructed evidence. We will allow her to weave her narrative of a conniving, murderous consort. We will let her persuade the entire court of Arya's culpability." "Your Majesty, that is an audacious gamble," Gregor cautioned, his brow creased in concern. "Should the court turn entirely against her, then they will witness the consequences of absolute royal decree." Lucian concluded, his voice lowering, hinting at retribution. "Lyra will overextend herself. Her arrogance is her undoing, and we shall wield it as a weapon. At the zenith of her perceived victory, when she believes all is hers, Arya will pose a single question. A question only the individual who handled the wolf's bane could possibly answer." He elucidated the final element of his stratagem, the unexpected witness Merrick had secured, a stable hand Lyra had bribed to falsify the evidence, and whom she then attempted to eliminate. He was alive, and he was ready. "This trial is not for Arya," Lucian stated, his gaze sweeping across his devoted followers, binding them to his unwavering resolve. "It is for Lyra. It signifies her undoing, and she will be the one to ready the instrument of her demise." A somber understanding permeated the chamber. This was not the act of a diminished monarch. This was the masterful stroke of a predator who had lured his quarry into the perfect snare. He glanced towards the sole window, where the first pale hues of dawn were beginning to suffuse the sky. Soon it would all be concluded. He had staked his entire realm, his very existence, and the destiny of his cherished mate on a single, desperate wager. Moments later, the resonant toll of heavy drums commenced, a slow, mournful cadence that signaled the imminent commencement of a royal adjudication. The time had arrived. He strode towards the chamber doors, his loyalists falling into formation behind him. As he approached the exit, Merrick spoke. "She is formidable, Your Majesty, more so than any of them comprehend." Lucian paused, his hand resting on the door, a fleeting expression of raw vulnerability crossing his countenance. "I am aware," he responded softly. "She is shaping me, even as I shape her." With that, he pushed open the doors and stepped out to assume his position at the trial of the woman he held dear. The stage was meticulously set, the ambush carefully prepared, and the entire world was watching. The percussive rhythm of the drums resembled a funeral dirge. Each resonant beat vibrated through the stone floor, ascended through the worn soles of her simple leather footwear, and permeated her very being. Her very bones recalled him, and the assurances whispered in the oppressive darkness of his confinement. She was escorted between two guards, her hands bound not with iron chains but with a silken cord, a cruel mockery of her presumed status. She was not a captive, she was an offering. The grand doors of the hall swung inward, and the collective exhalation of 100 wolves holding their breath struck her with the force of a physical blow. She lifted her chin. She would not afford them the satisfaction of witnessing her terror. The hall was teeming, a veritable ocean of hostile, ravenous visages, and upon a raised dais sat her sister, Lyra, adorned in a gown of profound violet, the very emblem of the regal stature she so desperately coveted. Kale stood beside her, appearing pallid and apprehensive. Upon the uppermost throne sat Lucian, a sovereign of icy composure, his countenance a mask of frigid detachment, his golden eyes revealing nothing. Yet, as her gaze met his across the vast, hushed expanse, she felt it imprinted in fire, a silent resonance of the bond that entwined them. Be prepared. She was ready. They guided her to the center of the hall, a solitary wolf encircled by the pack. The silence stretched, dense and suffocating. Let the proceedings commence. Lucian's voice boomed, cold and definitive. Lyra ascended, a tableau of sorrowful obligation. She commenced her performance, her voice imbued with feigned grief as she recounted the tragic demise of Lord Theron. She presented the goblet, the faint traces of wolf's bane clearly discernible to all. Subsequently, she presented a witness, a maidservant with a countenance etched with terror, who avowed having observed Lady Arya near the conservatory shortly before the tournament, her hands smudged with earth. It was a flawless, artful fabrication. The evidence is unequivocal, Lyra declared, her voice thick with insincere tears as she turned to Lucian. This young woman, driven by a heart consumed by envy and a thirst for influence, has introduced murder into our sacred court. She is a blight. Her gaze then fell upon Arya, and for a fleeting instant the facade crumbled. Arya perceived the unadulterated, triumphant loathing beneath. She must be purified. A chorus of guttural assent rumbled through the assembled throng. This was the apex of her sister's triumph. "Does the accused wish to present any defense?" Lucian inquired, his voice devoid of inflection, hollow. Arya drew a profound breath, the mingled sense of apprehension and perspiration filling her lungs. This was her singular opportunity, her sole chance. "I do," she stated, her voice clear and unwavering, slicing through the murmurings. She did not direct her gaze at Lucian. Instead, she looked directly at her sister. "Lady Lyra, you appear to possess considerable knowledge concerning this potent substance. You identified it with such alacrity." Lyra's smile was patronizing. "I am well read, sister, unlike some." "Then you must be aware," Arya continued, her voice akin to the keen edge of ice, "that to prevent the wolf's bane from affecting the handler, its leaves must be pulverized with a silver pestle, not an iron one. Iron causes the toxins to neutralize." She paused, allowing the silence to hang heavy in the air. "So tell me, sister, when you were preparing the poison, did you remember to employ the silver?" The trap had been sprung. He observed from his elevated position as the color drained from Lyra's features. The entire hall fell into a bewildered silence. They did not comprehend the question, but Lyra did. In that single heartbeat, the world irrevocably shifted. Her meticulously crafted plan, her assured triumph, had just fractured. What is this absurdity?" Lyra stammered, her composure finally disintegrating. "Naturally, I would not possess such knowledge. I am not a purveyor of poisons." "Then how could you ascertain that the medicinal wolf's bane in the conservatory had not already been neutralized?" Arya pressed, her voice unrelenting. "Because it is cultivated for study, and is always initially crushed with iron to render it safe. The sole manner it could have been employed to dispatch Lord Theron is if someone brought their own silver pestle to the conservatory that day." A collective gasp rippled through the assembly. They were beginning to grasp the implication. The elegant deceit was unraveling. "This is preposterous!" Kale exclaimed, leaping to his feet. "She is attempting to mislead you." But it was too late. The seed of doubt had been sown. "Perhaps," Lucian remarked, his voice a low rumble that silenced all others. "We should consult someone who was present." He raised a single hand. "Bring forth the witness." The immense doors swung open once more, and Merrick entered, not alone, but accompanied by a young, terrified stable boy, his arm encased in a sling. The boy who was supposed to be deceased. The instant Lyra beheld him, she shattered. Her countenance contorted into a visage of pure, snarling fury. The performance had concluded. The monstrosity was revealed. "You!" she shrieked, her voice a raw, unlovely sound. "You were meant to be gone." Before any could react, before the guards could intervene, she lunged. Not at the stable boy, not at Lucian, but at Arya. Her fingernails were like talons aimed at her sister's face, but she never reached her. In the span of a breath, Lucian was no longer on his throne. He was a blur of silver and shadow, a silent tempest of wrath that moved with impossible speed. He materialized before Arya, a living bulwark of sinew and fury. He seized Lyra's wrist in a grip of unyielding iron, his golden eyes blazing with the accumulated ferocity of the wolf he had suppressed for a decade. "You," he growled, his voice a low, terrifying promise of annihilation that caused the very stones of the hall to tremble, "will never touch her again." The power that emanated from him was absolute, a primal surge of alpha dominance that compelled every wolf present, lord, lady, and guard alike, to their knees, all but one. Behind him, Arya stood tall, her head held high, unbowed, unbroken. The trial had concluded. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The stable boy's testimony, coupled with Lyra's own confession of attempted murder, sealed the fate of the traitors. Kale and the other dissenting lords were divested of their titles and ancestral lands, their covens brought under the direct dominion of the crown. They had gambled for power and forfeited everything. Now only Lyra remained, held captive between two guards, her face a disarray of tears and venomous resentment. The court remained hushed, awaiting his pronouncement. The former Lucian, the Ice King, would have ordered her execution without hesitation. It would have been just. It would have been expedient. But he was no longer that man. He glanced at Arya, who observed him, her expression devoid of vindictiveness, instead exhibiting a steady resolve. She had triumphed. She required no bloodshed to validate her victory. "Lady Lyra Vale," he declared, his voice calm and resonant, "for your treason against the crown and for the attempted murder of your sister, Lady Arya, you are hereby dispossessed of your name and title. You shall be exiled to the Wailing Peaks to live out your days in solitude, where your venom can harm no one but yourself." He paused. "It is a clemency you do not merit, yet my queen has imparted to me the value of such." A howl of pure rage was Lyra's sole response as the guards dragged her away. He was a king, and a king must exhibit strength, not merely through ferocity, but through sagacity. And that was a lesson Arya had imparted to him. As the hall began to empty, a new epoch commenced. He addressed his stunned court, his voice ringing with an authority they had never before witnessed. He spoke not of rigid laws, but of the resurgence of weakened bonds. He articulated a new path forward, a dominion founded on trust and truth, not solely on fear and subjugation. He was no longer merely their sovereign. He was their alpha in every conceivable sense. Finally, his duties were fulfilled. The lords were dismissed, the traitors dealt with, the realm secured, and only one matter remained. He turned and saw her standing there, a solitary flame within the vast, deserted hall. She had not moved. She had awaited him. He approached her, the sound of his boots the sole noise in existence. He stopped before her and for the first time allowed her to perceive the entirety of his gaze, the apprehension, the relief, the remorse, and the all-encompassing, overwhelming love. "Arya," he uttered, his voice rough with emotion, and that was all he could articulate. Her name lingered in the space between them, a profound promise. He stood before her, not as the unfeeling monarch or the dominant alpha, but as Lucian, the wolf with the haunted eyes and the fractured heart that she, somehow, had helped to mend. The hall was now deserted, the shadows long and tranquil. Her fury had dissipated, her fear had vanished. In their stead resided a quiet, deep-seated sense of absolute rightness. She was precisely where she was meant to be. "You referred to me as your queen," she whispered. The words were both an inquiry and an affirmation. "I did," he replied, his voice soft. He extended his hand, his touch hesitating for a moment before he gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, his touch sending a warm tremor through her. "I was hopeful you would not object." A slow smile spread across her features, the first genuine, unadulteratedly happy smile she had experienced in what felt like an eternity. "I am not the woman they selected for you, Lucian." "No," he concurred, his golden eyes impossibly tender. "You are not the woman they selected. You are the wolf my soul chose." He took her hands in his grasp warm and steady. "I have reigned over a silent, desolate kingdom for 10 years. Arya, you have breathed life back into it. You have brought me back to life." Her chest ached with the exquisite, overwhelming truth of it all. She was not a vulnerability, she was his strength. Her intrinsic worth was not a gift bestowed by a mate or a title. It was the internal fire that had refused to be extinguished, even in the profoundest darkness. "Stand beside me, Arya," he murmured, his voice a low, heartfelt entreaty. "Not as my possession, not as a symbol, but as my partner, my equal, my queen." She gazed into the eyes of the wolf who had saved her, the king whom she had, in turn, rescued. And she offered him her answer. "Yes," she declared. And as he lowered his head to bestow upon her a kiss not born of desperation or fiery passion, but of a deep and unending tranquility, she knew she had finally found her sanctuary. The ostracized maiden had ascended to the throne of a queen. The Ice King had discovered his guiding light. And within the core of the frigid stone citadel, a new, warmer, and immeasurably stronger dominion was emerging.